Known as the philosopher's historian, Diogenes Laertius preserved much of the wisdom and ideas of ancient Western civilization. Combining historical facts with comical anecdotes, avoiding speculation or projecting his own opinions and theories, without his book, truly little would have survived the Dark Ages. Diogenes Laertius' second book, Socrates and Xenophon. After the natural philosophers, Diogenes mentions that Socrates might have helped Euripides write some of his plays. Several fragments by lost playwrights attest to that fact. It seems that the great playwright was friends with various philosophers, as some of the same fragments also mention Anaxagoras. Either way, this introduces the possibility that Socrates also knew and learned from Anaxagoras. Likewise, somehow, Socrates might have worked on, sculpted, some of the artwork on the Acropolis. Speaking of this, the historian quotes a passage from Timon's Silly.
From these diverged the sculptor, a prater about laws, the enchanter of Greece, inventor of subtle arguments, the sneerer who mocked at fine speeches, half Attic in his mock humility.
That surely must be interpreted as a reference to Socrates. By the way, Timon was a skeptic philosopher that Diogenes will describe in the 9th book. Socrates must have been a really good public speaker, since the 30 tyrants, according to Xenophon, forbade him to speak in public. Of this, Diogenes says,
"Frequently, owing to his vehemence in argument, men set upon him with their fists or tore his hair out, and that for the most part he was despised and laughed at, yet bore all this ill usage patiently."
This leads to the remark regarding the donkey's kick. Meaning, if a donkey kicks you, would you then kick the donkey in return? LOL. I also enjoyed Socrates' remark after reading Heraclitus.
The part I understand is excellent, and so too is, I dare say, the part I do not understand, but it needs a Delian diver to get to the bottom of it.
There might be an aphorism buried in that line. Diogenes also describes some of Socrates' military feats, mainly the manner he saved Alcibiades. This segues on the philosopher's opinion of democracy. I very much welcomed seeing my own opinion that
His strength of will and attachment to the democracy are evident from his refusal to yield to Critias and his colleagues.
What is more, there is the event described in Xenophon's Hellenica.
He alone voted for the acquittal of the 10 generals, and again from the facts that when he had the opportunity to escape from the prison he declined to do so.
Surely, Socrates very much liked democracy. He refuses to avoid punishment, as he would not dare to violate the democratic will. Also, the tone of this section inclines me to think that the historian at least does not think highly of monarchy. Socrates was unaffected by the plague that struck during the first years of the war against Sparta. As a result, when the city agreed that men should be allowed to do so, as there was a shortage of citizens, he had children with 2 different women. Believe it or not, the second woman was a daughter of Aristides, Plutarch's great and noble democratic leader. Diogenes then reports many examples wherein the philosopher demonstrated the ability, the talent, of changing other people's minds or opinions. This segues into questions about the man's piety.
He was nearest to the gods in that he had the fewest wants.
Furthermore, consider the line according to Xenophon.
There is, he said, only one good, that is, knowledge, and only one evil, that is, ignorance. Wealth and good birth bring their possessor no dignity, but on the contrary evil.
Surely, that is not impiety, it is rational piety. Diogenes makes little mention of the sign, the demon, that Socrates spoke of. Instead, he mentions how Socrates would not be bothered by the comedic playwrights, that he took pride in his famously strong wife, and that the oracle proclaimed him as the wisest person. Of the charges that ended his life, the biographer attributes it all to the envy of lesser men. Finally, he honors him by saying,
"So he was taken from among men, and not long afterwards the Athenians felt such remorse that they shut up the training grounds and gymnasia. They banished the other accusers, but put Miletus to death. They honored Socrates with a bronze statue, the work of Lysippus, which they placed in the hall of processions."
Diogenes also writes his own poem. I will quote this one.
"Drink then, being in Zeus's palace, O Socrates. For truly did the god pronounce thee wise, being wisdom himself. For when thou didst frankly take the hemlock at the hands of the Athenians, they themselves drained it as it passed thy lips.
Others by this name include a historian who wrote about the geography of Argos, a peripatetic philosopher from Bithynia, a poet, and lastly a man who wrote about the philology of divine terms. Notice how much writing existed without the printing press. One must opine that simply having temples that were also libraries made books accessible enough. Jocularly, Diogenes first describes the famed philosophical historian by saying that he was not only of utmost modesty, but also extremely handsome. Surely, such a mixture is most rare. There is mention of how Socrates recruited him as a student. The philosopher asked him where a man would go to get food, and noting that the answer was obvious, then asked,
"And where do men become good and honorable?"
That did it for Xenophon. He became a student of philosophy henceforth. Diogenes attributes him as the first to ever keep notes of conversations, of Socrates' conversations, which he then used in writing his most valuable memorabilia. Apparently, he was also the first to write a history of philosophers. Alas, that book did not survive. The historian describes how he joined the mercenary force recruited by Cyrus. A mention is made of his friend Proxenus, who studied under Gorgias. Unfortunately, Diogenes will not include Gorgias in his biographies. Either way, of this part of his life, Diogenes does not explain anything that Xenophon himself does not say in his own Anabasis, except for the fact that he was exiled from Athens because he was accused of siding with Agesilaus, the Spartan king. After the expedition into Persia and the march back, which is better learned from Xenophon himself, he traveled all over Greece. It should suffice for me to quote that.
From that time onward he hunted, entertained his friends, and worked at his histories without interruption.
Oh, it is also noteworthy to remark that he had 2 sons. Both fought for Sparta, and one of them died in the final battle against Thebes, the one wherein Epaminondas also died. This is very valuable as it makes clear Xenophon's bias when describing those events. Yes, one can almost feel Xenophon's sorrow in that story. Regardless, Xenophon wrote more than 40 books. Of course, only a handful survived. Diogenes provides a list. Worthy of a laugh, consider the lines.
By the sweetness of his narrative, he earned the name of the Attic Muse. Hence, he and Plato were jealous of each other, as will be stated in the chapter on Plato.
I do believe that jealous is too strong of a word for these men, lol. Also, a certain Demetrius of Magnesia argues that the constitutions of Athens and Sparta, which are still attributed to Xenophon, were in fact written by Thucydides. Either way, it was Xenophon that published Thucydides' Pan-Hellenic War, which people erroneously title the Peloponnesian War. The 2 historians knew each other, and so Xenophon continued the history where Thucydides died. There were 6 others Xenophon worthy of remark. I fear that for such long lists I will not mention each one. I did find it curious that there was another historian that wrote a biography of Epaminondas and Pelopidas. Shame that such a work is lost. We have no surviving biography of Epaminondas, the greatest democratic leader. Likewise, there was a Xenophon that wrote of Hannibal the Great Carthaginian. OMZ. What a lost. Surely, the same may be said for the works of all 6 now lost Xenophon, thus his existence. Alas, all that remains is what is yet to be destroyed. The remaining part of Diogenes' second book focuses on hedonism, the often misunderstood and reproached philosophy of pleasure. Don't miss it. Now, as usual, I gift you some aphorisms.
The parts I understood were great, and the parts I will have to read again to understand were even better.
As divinity does not need anything, the less you need in life, the more your life is divine.
Forgetfulness is the wisest, for it is the most forgiving and acceptant.
If honesty of memory, willingness to be ashamed and regretful,
were the same for all people, then the wisest would be the elders.